Welcome to the latest episode of Claw's Corner. Today's guest is an author and producer. His books include Little Girl Blue, The Life of Karen Carpenter. He also compiled and edited Yesterday Once More, The Carpenter Reader, Judy Garland on Judy Garland, Interviews and Encounters, and Dolly on Dolly, Interviews and Encounters with Dolly Parton. He was a creative consultant on several television documentaries on the Carpenters. They included True Hollywood Story, A&E's biography, and VH1's Behind the Music, as well as being a contributor to the award-winning podcast Dolly Parton's America. I first met my guest on October 19th, 2023, where he was touring with his new documentary, Karen Carpenter, Starving for Perfection. It was airing at Cafe 9 in New Haven, Connecticut, the city where Richard and Karen were both born. I have seen many documentaries on the Carpenters, and I can say without a doubt, this is by far the best and most in-depth documentary on the duo that I have ever seen. So here to talk about all of that and much, much more is Randy Schmidt. Randy, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to visit with you finally.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is right now, it's the end of December. So I met you several months ago. I saw this documentary. I loved it. I've been a huge fan of the Carpenters for years. Then I went and read your book, and I thought I knew everything about the Carpenters, but there is so much to the family, and you really dug deep on this. And it's you know what's funny, when I tell people about this, I was talking off the air to people, and the one thing that people said was sad. It's so sad, like such a great life cut short, and why it had to be cut short. So I want to go all the way back to the beginning. We'll start there. So Karen originally loved sports. She really wasn't into music originally, but Richard was, I'm not sure how old he was, maybe 9 years old or so. He loved piano, but his first instructor said, yeah, you're not good enough. Is that correct? We'll start back then.
Yeah, he didn't take it all that seriously early on. And I think it was because it was probably the wrong teacher, is the wrong fit, I think is what I've heard him say before. And it was after he got with the right teacher that things really took off. And he always had a passion for music, but mainly listening to music early on. And that's where he and Karen bonded over those the records and things that they would listen to together in the early days.
Yeah, because they used to listen to their father's records in New Haven.
Right. And it was really exciting to be in New Haven for the New Haven Documentary Film Festival, because we also got to go and visit the childhood home. The current owners of the childhood home let us in, and along with a couple of Karen's childhood friends, we got to go down in the basement and see where the swings had been screwed into the rafters, where Karen and Richard used to swing and listen to the music. There was this built-in sort of a metal table kind of thing in the corner that is in a lot of the pictures of Karen and Richard as children. And that is the table, or it's kind of like an L-shaped corner table, where all of the 78s in the record racks were. And so it's still there. It was real. It takes a lot after 30 something years of being a Carpenters fan to really wow me after this point, because I've got to be in different homes of theirs or see their cars and or outfits that they wore and that sort of thing. But so it's kind of like, okay, not anything really new comes along like that. And so I'd been by the house many times on the outside, but this was the first time to get to tour it and see Karen's bedroom and things like that. It's really exciting.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because as I mentioned in the intro, I was at Cafe 9 because I live in Connecticut. And at that was such a great showing, because not only did you have the movie, but you also had childhood friends there. I got a chance to talk to them and meet them. And then you also had several musicians play Carpenter songs. So it was such a fun event. It wasn't just somebody putting a screen down and showing the movie. You had a whole event. So that was so great. I got a chance to meet their childhood friends, and they seemed very, very nice. And one of the things that you could sort of see through a lot of the interviews, that Karen had it seemed like she had such a zest for life, and especially in the very beginning before she got sick, and she had such a great sense of humor. And that's even what her friend said too.
Yeah, I loved that her friend Carol was telling us how her mother, when Karen would come over, she would say, well, there's Hollywood. And because Karen was a little bit of a showman, I guess you could say. She was kind of class clown. Yeah. And my dog wants to get in the shot here, so I hope you don't mind. This is Zeke.
Hi, Zeke. Welcome to the Claw's Corner, Zeke.
Anyway, they the thing with Karen being just kind of goofy as a kid, she was always silly and had such a slanted take on lots of things, and she could, you know, really make people laugh. And I think that that kind of goes with, I think it was Olivia Newton-John who told me she was kind of like a clown,
Yeah.
where she was funny and you know, silly and made people laugh, but then there was a dark side too,
Yeah.
because you knew that it was kind of masking or hiding some of the sadness that was obviously going on in her life.
Yeah, that's actually another takeaway from the documentary. I had no idea that she and Olivia were such great friends.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I was reading in either your book or saw in a documentary, in 1982, she was going to help play drums for some of the songs on the physical tour, but unfortunately, by that time, she was too fragile and too weak. And they said, all right, well, maybe next tour, and by then it was too late. So I mean, so they were really close, and it was, I think she heard it on the radio. Maybe she was on her way to either see her or she was going to have lunch with her, and she heard it on the radio and said, you know, unfortunately, Karen Carpenter is dead. But wow, so that was another takeaway, that she and Olivia were so close. And yeah, I got that from the friend, and also I was maybe not too surprised from watching the interviews. Richard was a lot more serious than Karen. Richard was I mean, that's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, definitely didn't have the same sense of humor,
Yeah.
and didn't have the same gosh, he was definitely uncomfortable. I think a lot of times he was maybe strange, introverted, and Karen had this she exuded, you know, positivity and joy, and Richard was very, very serious for sure.
It almost seems like the parents' names are Agnes and Harold. Almost like Agnes and Richard had similar personalities, where Harold and Karen were more laid back, more quiet, and just, you know, didn't let things bother them as much, or weren't as like intense as Richard and Agnes. That was the impression I got from reading the book and seeing a lot of some of the documentaries, including Starving for Perfection.
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, because there were certain aspects of each. I think they got certain aspects of each parent, because Richard was very much like his dad in the car collecting and in that side of things. But yeah, personality wise, Harold was kind of the jokester, and even though he was very quiet about it, and Agnes was way more serious, and so definitely more like Richard in that way. But you know, people say that Karen was very strong-willed and sometimes could be demanding in the way that Agnes was. You know, if she didn't like how something was going on tour, she would, you know, let people know about it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into all of this, but one of the things I did find out is how an example of that was the band wanted to do some improv, and what did Karen do?
Yeah, anything that wasn't practiced and wasn't rehearsed down to even, you know, the exact line that they were going to say to the audience or whatever, it was all scripted, and anything that went off book or off script became an issue. You know, the musicians really couldn't play their riff and the night before and on the album or whatever before. It was not encouraged at all.
Wow. Right. One of the biggest things I said, there's a lot of things I realized about Karen Carpenter. I didn't realize what a phenomenal drummer she was too. I mean, she started off being a drummer before she became a singer. And it was funny. I did an interview with Sheila E.'s guitar player. When I was doing research on him, I saw an interview with Sheila, and she goes, yeah, one of my biggest influences is Karen Carpenter. This is maybe 2 years ago. I said, really? Karen Carpenter? And then watching your documentary, you have clips. I did not realize she loved jazz musicians like Joe Morell, Dave Brubeck, and Ringo Starr was another favorite of hers. But she always considered herself a drummer foremost and then a singer second, which was really surprising to me too.
Yeah. And, you know, we had an interview set up with Sheila E. at one point, and she ended up not coming to Dallas. Our production company's Dallas based. So a lot of times I will look to see who's coming to the area and see if there's any relation to whatever it is that I'm researching at the time. And she ended up at the last minute not coming, but she's been in some other Carpenters documentaries, and she's you know, fantastic to hear talk about how she was inspired by Karen, because you just didn't see women on the drums back then. It was so unusual.
Yeah, and with Karen, they kept telling her, it's like, women don't play drums, but maybe that's where the strong will came in, because she said, nope, I want to play drums. She got that snare drum and she just kept doing that. And what was the reason she started playing drums? Do you think it was more just because Richard was playing piano, she wanted to be with Richard because she idolized Richard, or was it more to get out of gym class?
That's what the rumor is that or that's even what she would say, is that she got out of gym so that she could get into band, or I guess vice versa. She wanted to get out of gym so that she knew that she could get a PE credit for the marching band that way.
I love it.
I think there was a love for music there, but she didn't think there was an ability necessarily yet, because there was definitely a love for music in the household.
Yeah.
And but she just did it at the beginning so that she could get out of gym, and then she says that she took choir so that she could get out of her math class or something like that. So she was very creative in that way, and ended up first on the glockenspiel, but she played in the drum line, like at least close by. So
yeah,
that's what really got her interested in the drums. She was watching these guys that were like this one that we interviewed, Frankie Chavez, who Karen credited throughout her entire life as the one who inspired her to want to play the drums. He had been playing since he was 3 years old, and had played with some of the masters of jazz, and was considered a child prodigy on the drums. And so her watching him, she wanted to do exactly what he did. And he had his name across the drum head, the bass drum head, and she had to do that too. And so there was definitely an effort from her to be like the guys in her high school.
Yep. Now, you mentioned she was in choir. Did she ever have any kind of singing lessons at all? Because she has, actually, the one thing that people always say, it doesn't matter if they like rock, if they like metal, whenever I mention the Carpenters, every time she has the voice of an angel. Not one person did not say that, and it's so true. It doesn't matter what kind of music you like, you always have an appreciation and as respect for the Carpenters, and Karen especially, when it comes to her vocals. So was she ever taught?
Well, she was in the high school choir, and she knew enough about music, she said, to know that the choir sang out of tune.
Yeah.
But when you sing in choir, usually you're singing in a way to match your voices to everyone else's, to create that blend that makes one big sound, which is of course what the Carpenters did with their voices years later. But in a choir situation, she was probably singing up in her higher voice, like a falsetto kind of voice that wouldn't have really given her any insight into the voice that she had beneath. So it didn't emerge until later on, when she was encouraged to drop down lower on something that Richard was having her work on, one of his songs. And that's when they realized there was this whole other register down there.
Yep. Well, what did
I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt. You had asked about singing lessons other than being in choir. She continued in the choir in college at Cal State Long Beach whenever she went there after graduation from high school. And she took a few voice lessons from Frank Pooler, who was their college choir director. Most people would know him because he's the lyricist for Merry Christmas, Darling.
Okay.
And he was the only person who ever gave her voice lessons. And as she was in college, she did what other music majors did. They had to do every semester what's called a jury, and it's basically their final exam for that semester, where they go in and have to sing an art song, like a classical piece for voice. And he would quite often ask her to imitate. She would like to imitate different types of singers, or make fun of different things. Again, it's that Hollywood thing that we noticed from the time she was little. And so a lot of times she would sing her song, and then he would say, now do it like this, or now show them how you imitated this person singing the song, or whatever.
Was he the instructor that said, don't do a thing, keep it the way it is?
Absolutely. I think there are professors and there are voice teachers who at times, sorry,
No problem.
There are voice teachers and those who will kind of go with the philosophy that, you can do things to learn about healthy singing as
Mhm.
far as phrasing and breathing and things like that that don't really affect the natural instrument. And that was his thing. I don't think he meant for her to, don't study it, don't try to do anything different, but you don't need to change your voice. Like here, we can work on, singing techniques and things like that. But as far as the voice itself, it's such a unique instrument.
Well, what impressed me the most doing my research on this was when you listen to her, she has such a powerful voice. But from what a lot of people said, she'd be practicing and you could barely hear her. She's almost sounds like a whisper. Then as soon as she gets behind that mic, that booming voice happens. It's like she just knew how to project her voice. Because I mean, I was in metal bands in my 20s, and I know people talk about, singers breathe through their diaphragm, and I don't know how to do any of that. But it seems like
Yeah.
she had perfect control, pitch control with everything, and she knew exactly not to strain her voice, just sing really low. But as soon as she gets behind that mic loved her.
Yeah, it was kind of a magical union where I'm sure she sounded lovely just hearing her on an acoustic level in the room, but it was, as Richard has said many times, it was that moment that the voice hit the mic that it became really, really magical. And there are some people who their voices and a microphone don't mix well,
Yeah,
and they sound fantastic when they're just singing out into the room or whatever, and then the microphone ends up maybe changing it not for the better.
yeah.
But hers was the other way around. It took it and multiplied it in wonderful ways.
All right, I want to talk about this. Let's talk about the Brady Bunch connection. Who is Neely Plum?
Oh, that's a funny one. So Neely Plum was the guy at RCA Records that had signed the Richard Carpenter trio to that label briefly, after having seen them at the Hollywood Bowl whenever they were in the contest there, the Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands, and they were signed to that recording label just strictly as an instrumental group. Karen didn't sing a note at that performance or anything. So, but the Brady Bunch connection there. Neely Plum is the father of Eve Plum,
Mhm.
Jan Brady on the
Yes.
Brady Bunch. I think that's pretty interesting too. I'm glad you picked that out. Nobody's ever asked me about that one.
Totally. I did my research on this. There was a lot of facts in there that you had. Yeah. Well, talking about that, I'm so impressed with the Battle of the Bands, which was June 24th, 1966. I played a Battle of the Bands. I won $50. I mean, for them to win a Battle of Bands and get a contract with RCA, that's really impressive.
It wasn't an exact result of that.
Yeah.
It wasn't like you win this contest and you get a record deal. It just so happened that he was in the audience that night,
Okay.
and he ended up giving his card to Richard in the parking lot that night after the contest. So a lot of times it's kind of presented in the way that, and they won this contract, but no, it was as a result of being seen and heard there, but it wasn't part of the package.
Yep. Well, they had a knack of being at the right place at the right time. There's another point where Burt Bacharach wrote a song close to you. They sang it. They didn't realize Burt Bacharach was in the audience, and they're like, "Hey, you want to open up for us?" It's like there's a lot of times where maybe it wasn't that easy, but almost like right place, right times. I know Burt Bacharach. I've heard interviews with him, and he loved their version of. He almost begged them to play his song because he loved the way they sounded, from what I heard.
It started as a medley that Richard was putting together, a bunch of hit songs that Burt had done. They had been brought in to play for some sort of a benefit that Burt was going to be at, and so they put together this medley of this group of songs that he had done, and it was Herb Alpert who brought them close to you and said, "Hey, I don't know if this will fit in the medley that you're working on, but he had recorded it at that point and he didn't feel comfortable with it. He didn't like his version of it. So he said,
Yeah.
maybe you can do something with it." And Richard really transformed the song. That's where, his contribution to this team, as of course, I don't think they would have ever been anything without Karen's voice, because it's so unique. And even saying one in a million seems like, I don't know, I haven't found anybody else in a million that's anywhere close to her. So but it was his arranging techniques that took a song like Close to You that had been recorded by a number of different people. The very first one, I think, was Richard Chamberlain had done a recording of it. It had been on a Dionne Warwick album, and nobody got the right feel for it. Like, it was very straightforward, and it just didn't have much personality to it. And then Richard came in and give it that swing, bum bum ba bum bum ba bum, which was completely different than anybody else had ever done it. And so he was able to take a song like that was a nice song, but then elevate it to where it became a really great record because of what he did in the arranging.
Yeah, well, he, as you mentioned, he definitely had a knack for that. I mean, I love the Beatles. Well, it's funny because they said they were the three Bs. They were influenced by the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and Burt Bacharach.
Yeah.
But I love their version of Ticket to Ride. It's such a great arrangement. And I mean, Beatles are probably my all-time favorite bands. And usually when I hear somebody try to do a cover song, I'm like, but that's one version I can listen to over and over again. I just love the way she sounds. I love his arrangement. And some of the other songs, like, well, perfect example is the bank commercial, Paul Williams.
Right. Like We've only just begun.
Yeah, and which is probably like the biggest wedding song of all time. So it's just that, like, was he always just looking? Did he ever write? I mean, I know the arrangement, but he never was really into writing lyrics. He was more about taking other songs and changing it and making it his own.
Richard wasn't much of a lyricist. I mean, he did write some lyrics here and there, but he worked with other lyricists, and mainly John Bettis, who, years later he would write Goodbye to Love and Top of the World and Yesterday Once More. So he did write, but Richard was usually on just the musical side of that versus the lyrics. His forte was really taking someone else's song, hearing something, not necessarily like a cover like they did with the Beatles, but maybe hearing a demo track that they were submitted in a stack of hundreds of demos, and being able to go, that one's a hit, or hear the finished record in his head the way that he and Karen would end up doing it.
Yeah. Well, another example of that, where he was watching a Johnny Carson show and he saw Bette Midler sing a song called Groupie.
Yeah, I love that. It's Tom Nolan he's a writer from Rolling Stone, and in our documentary he said it's a song about a groupie if you want to be cruel about it. And but yeah, it's a song that you might not necessarily at first listen think, oh, that's a Carpenter song, and it ended up that their arrangement is the one that I think most people think of, and they hear those echoing trumpet riffs and things on the chorus that if you do that song now and those aren't there, it seems like there's something missing, because they're such an integral part of that piece now.
Is it true that Bette Midler was mad that they won an award for that song?
There was this weird little feud between Bette and Karen, and after Carpenters became pretty well known, Bette would sometimes make fun of Karen in her routines, and she would talk about how the Carpenters, Karen is so white that she's invisible.
Oh my God!
And so there was a little banter between them, and then Carpenters presented. They were the ones presenting the Best New Artist Award at the Grammys when Bette received it, and she made a joke about, oh, Miss Karen, and she said, I'm surprised she didn't hit me over the head with it. But Karen said something, and they were friendly. I mean, friendly banter back and forth when they would be in person. But Karen was interviewed by the LA Times about something else, and they asked her about this thing with Bette Midler, and she said, well, we're the ones that have the gold record for Superstar on our wall at home. So all right. She wasn't one to be nasty or anything. She wasn't going to tell jokes about Bette in return, but she got a little jab there in the LA Times.
Well, one person that really liked her and had a lot of respect for her, and she did some things for her, was Petula Clark.
Right. They kind of, it's weird that they traveled in sort of the same circles, or they ended up being at the same events and that sort of thing. I believe it was a premiere, the LA premiere for Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which is something Petula was, of course, involved in, and that's where they met her the first time. So I don't know. I think she kind of took Karen under her wing a little bit, and there were times that they would correspond or reach out to one another if they were in the same cities and that kind of thing.
Well, there's also a time where they won a song for, it was the Oscars, and they couldn't sing the song because there was some kind of rule that they were never featured in a movie. So Petula Clark sang that song for them.
Yeah, that kind of brought them a little bit closer together too, because I know that I think Carpenters sent Petula a telegram the night that she sang it and said, "Sing it pretty." And yeah, there was a rule and that has since been done away with, obviously, but that you couldn't perform on the Oscars telecast unless you had appeared in a movie. And so they would get other people to sing those songs, and Petula was the one that was asked to sing For All We Know, which did win the Oscar that year.
Which I think it was the following year is when they changed the rule. But then they sang, I think it was maybe the next Oscars or the Oscars after that, where they actually sang another song. So they did have a chance to sing at the Oscars. But yeah, unfortunately, from what I was reading or listening or saw in one of the documentaries, that was the final year that rule was in effect.
Yeah, I think it was Bless the Beast and the Children that they
That's what it was. Yeah.
Sing.
Yep. All right. Since we're going through the songs, I want to talk about some of the songs. You mentioned it a little bit, but one song I thought, well, Richard actually came up with it with the music because it was a Bing Crosby movie. And in the movie, he was the biggest singer in the world. He kept on saying, "Yeah, I got this hit single called Goodbye to Love, Goodbye to Love." And Richard's like, Mike should write a song like that. And he came up with this great melody for it. And what I found so interesting about that song is, as popular as they were, their fans wanted the same. They did not like anything different. They were very tough on the Carpenters. And that was one song where Richard put a guitar solo in there. And what was the fans' reaction at first?
Well, I'm sure the younger fans didn't have a problem with it, but the Carpenters reached so many different generations with their music, and it was everybody from grandparents down to little kids that would come to their concerts. So I'm sure that the younger crowd didn't have any qualms about it, or even necessarily notice that it was out of place in the way that the older listeners did. But there was that feeling, I think, by some of their older listeners that they had sold out, that they had gone rock or something, just because they had this grungy sounding guitar solo atop a ballad. And Richard is still credited as kind of helping to invent in that moment the power ballad. I mean, there may have been other instances around the same time, of course, but that's one of the earliest examples of like that shredding kind of guitar solo atop a beautiful melodic ballad.
Yeah, I love that song.
And it kind of became a formula for them, especially later years. They would, have this beautiful ballad, and then there would be this Tony Peluso, the guy who played guitar for them. There would be this fuzz guitar solo right there in the middle of it. So it sort of became formulaic for them to do things like that in later years.
Well, as I mentioned, the fans loved, maybe like the squeaky clean, but there was a point where Richard and Karen did not like that image at all. They didn't like the goody, or as they called goody four shoes.
Goody four shoes, yeah.
Goody four shoes. So they were trying to change their image a little bit. So they went to some radio shows and they were talking about Vietnam, how they were against Vietnam, and they were talking about how they hate organized religion and they thought Vietnam was a mistake. So what happened with the publicists? What did they must have been like, whoa, calm down here.
Yeah, I don't think that they had been warned to not share their beliefs on controversial subjects like that.
Yeah.
And so they went into one of these early interviews that they did with a guy in Chicago on the radio station there, and they just let it all out as far as religion and politics and all these things, and they were immediately told, never again. And I think it was after that really the goody four shoes kind of thing. They were sometimes called the Pepsodent twins, or people would make fun of their teeth because they said they had chiclet teeth, that they were, squeaky clean. this image that sort of plagued them. People made fun of them for their hair and for their clothing and things like that. And as we get into in the documentary a little bit, and I think it was Cubby O'Brien, their drummer, who said, these newspapers and magazines and things would send rock and roll reviewers to review a Carpenters concert, and they just didn't get it because they weren't, Carpenters weren't rock and roll, even though they had a grunge guitar solo in one song. And so they couldn't necessarily find anything wrong with the music because it was beautiful, it was well constructed. And so they ended up usually making fun of them for their appearances and for their hair and for the way their audience reacted, that people stayed sitting in their seats and, sat arm in arm and those kinds of things. So they ended up taking a lot of heat for things that were just pretty ridiculous. People didn't really understand how to, or at least they didn't have the right reviewers, I guess, coming to do that. Maybe a classical reviewer would have been more ready for something like Carpenters.
Yeah, well, it's sad because why do they even have to go for the negative? Why can't they talk about the positive? I mean, people, unfortunately, it's even way worse today than probably is now, but just everybody goes for the negative instead of the positive. And another thing that sort of was a backlash, bad timing. They had a chance to go to the White House. What era was that?
They were at a hotel near the White House when Nixon was on TV giving a statement about Watergate. And so it was right there. They performed, I believe it was May 1st of 73. And it was, I was interested to know like what they really thought about it, because there hadn't been much talk about their politics or anything in those days. And it was Cubby O'Brien who, as the drummer said, it was kind of a joke to them because of the time that they were going there, because everybody was talking about what was brewing with Watergate at that point. And then at the same time, they don't want to turn down an invitation to go to the White House and be part of this. So yeah, it was kind of crazy to watch Nixon introducing them as young America at its very best. As if they needed any other reason to not be cool than they're having Nixon saying how cool they are.
Oh, man. They just couldn't catch a break. You know what I loved about them? Even, I mean, I've seen videos of them winning awards. They just seem so unassuming, so happily surprised. There was no ego about them at all from the impression I get. They just like, oh, wow, really? They almost seem surprised. I mean, all the success they had, and they're like, really? Us? I love that about them.
Yeah, I think it definitely came across that way. The ego side was in their musicianship at times. I think they knew that they were good musicians and they knew that they were good record makers, but there was definitely a humbleness to how they conducted themselves in public. And I think it's Richard that said that they had something like big ego and low self-esteem.
Yeah,
is the way he explained it somewhat recently, I think.
Did you ever have a chance to speak with Richard personally?
I talked to Richard as early as like 1995, 1996, and met up with him a few times, got to visit with him at length on several of those occasions. But when I went to go and interview him for my book, he wasn't interested at all. He told me that he'd said all he wants to say about Karen's personal problems. And I said, we can keep it totally about the music and the legacy and the recordings. And he still declined. So it was shortly thereafter that the book took a little bit of a turn. I think when I was still thinking I was going to get an interview with Richard, there was that part of me that still had my fan hat on.
Yeah.
I was still approaching this as a fan of the Carpenters versus a researcher and biographer.
Yeah.
And as more and more people started to come out of the woodwork and tell me more of the story, I was like, wow, this is completely a different book than it was, 6 months ago or a year ago. Mm-hmm. People that hadn't been asked to interview for, official authorized Carpenter's biography that happened back in the early 90s. And Karen's very, very best friend, who was the matron of honor at her wedding, wasn't ever asked to participate in any of those kinds of things. And I think it's because Richard knew what story they had to tell, and it differed enough from his and the family's points of view that they just conveniently left people like that out.
Yeah.
And it was when the guy who wrote the script for the TV movie told me about going to their door. You know, I opened the book with this because I think it says so much. He went to the Carpenter's door to meet with the parents. This was shortly after Karen had died. And the mom, Agnes, pushed the housekeeper out of the way and said, "I want you to know I did not kill my daughter." Mm. And it was, I just remember feeling like this bolt of electricity or something go through my body, like, whoa, and this was huge.
Yeah.
And so the book definitely took a different turn without Richard's input. And I think that he's knowing how he controls other projects. I'm glad that it went the way that it did. You know, I haven't interviewed him or visited with him since my book came out in 2010. I know it's probably a bit of a thorn in his side for people to know a lot of the stuff that he had worked so hard to keep undercover for so long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I finally took that fan hat off and became a journalist, became a biographer and researcher, and really started to dig in. And that's when Karen's close circle of girlfriends, the woman I mentioned earlier, her name was Frenda, and Olivia Newton-John, and
Suzanne Summers.
Suzanne Summers, actually, I didn't get to interview her for the book, but for the documentary, yes, she was fantastic. And you know, it's sad, as I've been to some of these film festivals and stuff, we put in a memorial for Olivia at the end of it, you know, right at the very end of the documentary. And then it's like, I think it was when we were in New Haven, like she had died the night before or the day before, really close with that. And so seeing it since then, the first two people that you hear talk about Karen in the documentary are Olivia, followed immediately by Suzanne. And I remember that night there were kind of gasps from people in the film festival audience that, oh, those two right in a row, you know, we've lost them so recently. And I'm glad I was able to document what I was able to do over the years and when I was able to, because we are losing a lot of people from their generation. I just found out this week that one of Karen's childhood friends, Debbie Cudicello, who was not able to join us at the thing in New Haven because of health reasons, she passed away just earlier this week. So we are losing people along the way that were big parts of the Carpenter's story and who helped me along the way. And I think if I were just now researching it, it would be much harder, because it's that generation is unfortunately starting to dwindle a bit.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, if I have it correct, wasn't she a bridesmaid in her wedding?
Yeah. She, the first time I met her, a group of fans, we went to New Haven in 1996, and she met us, and we took her and her husband. Actually, they took us to Pepe's, the famous pizza joint there in New Haven, and she was so welcoming and wonderful, and took us over to her parents' house on Hall Street, just down the street from where the Carpenters grew up, and showed us her albums and like photo albums, and pulled out her bridesmaid dress and things like that she had saved over the years. So very, very special memories of her, and she'll be missed for sure.
I want to go back to Richard, because this is where I learned a lot of, as you said, a lot of other documentaries don't dig this deep, but I did not realize how controlling Richard was. I mean, there's so many opportunities Karen could have had, but she was so worried about getting Richard mad. He would not. One example is Kenny Rogers. She wanted to audition for his band. He said no. Another one was, which I found surprising, John Wayne loved her so much he wanted her in the movie True Grit.
Yeah, John Wayne was a celebrity judge on a college, Your All-American College Show is what it was called. And the Carpenters, or the Richard Carpenter trio, performed on there. And in one of the finals or semifinals or something like that, John Wayne is said to have said to Karen, you'd be perfect for this part in True Grit. And it's been rumored, I don't know if it's ever been confirmed or not, but that she had actually gone to some sort of an audition or a screen test or something. Wouldn't that be to see if something like that surfaced? But yeah, there were things along the way that Karen had opportunities to do things on her own. And, she was offered a recording contract at 16. She did end up getting to do that. But at first, Agnes said, absolutely not without Richard. Yeah. And the thing was that you either take both of them or no deal. And I think it's because Agnes had decided early on, as Richard started to show promise, that he was going to be this superstar. He was going to be the next Liberace, this next concert pianist or whatever it might be. Mm. And Karen was part of the family support system that was supposed to be there for him until he became famous. And then as Karen began to be the one who got the spotlight, as part of this duo, there was guilt from her, feeling like, I've been raised all my life that we're supporting this guy and that he's the one with all the talent. And then why is everybody looking at me? All I do is sing. He does all these other things. And so there was that part of her that felt like, she wasn't worthy, I think, at times, or that she shouldn't do anything to eclipse him.
Yeah, it's sad that I'm hoping before she died, she realized what an impact she had on people and how much people loved and respected her. Do you think that actually happened? Do you think before she died, she realized that?
In some cases, I think yes. She would almost break free and do her own thing from time to time, but then that pull of the family and the expectations for her was so strong that she would, almost fling the doors wide open and say, this is me, I'm going to do my own thing. And then, oh, never mind, I'm going to close this and go back to recording with Richard again.
Now, that contract you mentioned earlier, was this the time where she was hired and Agnes said, nope, if you're going to hire Karen, you have to hire Richard. So just to appease her, they hired him as a writer, but he became so controlling, they said, you have to stay outside. There's no way you're going to be in the same room as Karen. Is that around the same time?
That was the same time. Joe Osborne was a famous bassist, and a lot of people know him for his work with the Wrecking Crew. Have you seen that documentary?
Oh yeah, I love that documentary. The background musicians that played in almost every band and every hit song, and nobody knows their name.
Well, and it's really unusual that Karen and Richard would encounter him so early on. But he was, this famous LA session bassist that played on all these, top 10 records throughout the 60s and 70s. And Karen went to go along with, both Karen and Richard went along with a trumpeter from Cal State Long Beach that they knew. And Richard was going to accompany him for an audition. At some point during the night, Karen sang, and Joe Osborne knew enough to go, wow, that, he heard that voice again over the microphone, and what that combination was. And he offered her a recording contract with his small label. It's basically his garage, but the garage label he called Magic Lamp Records. And, but yeah, Richard was brought in. Both of the songs that were released as a single together have Richard as the writing credit for those. But the story is that Joe didn't want his input constantly, and he would make him wait out in the hallway at times whenever they were recording.
Yeah, it's sad too, because before I even get to it, I want to talk about you mentioned Herb Alpert before. So it's Herb Alpert, Jerry Moss, A&M Records. At the time when Herb Alpert heard their demo, were they at that time? First they were the Richard Carpenter Trio, then they changed their name to Spectrum. Was it around that time when Herb Alpert heard that demo and signed them?
Spectrum had kind of shopped their demo. They were like a 5-piece vocal group, mostly comprised of their college friends. And they had shopped their demo tape really to everybody in town, and nobody was interested. And so because most of the songs they were doing were Richard's compositions, he got this idea to overdub their voices, and just him and Karen, after the rest of the group kind of all went their own ways, realizing it wasn't going to happen for them. They then took their demo with just their voices and that stacked overdubbed harmony sound back around, and were kind of, doors slammed in their faces all over again. But it made it to the desk of Herb Alpert at A&M Records, and he was known for signing eclectic groups and groups that wouldn't have fit in anywhere else. And he says that, Karen's voice reminded him of Patti Page, and the resonance of some of those, especially her, but singers from the 50s, that ballad singers and that sort of thing. He gave him the same kind of effect that Patti Page had. So he gave them a chance to come in and record their first album. And aside from Ticket to Ride, which it did hit the Hot 100, but it stalled at number 54, which I think is still pretty good for a debut.
Not bad at all.
But it wasn't considered a hit.
Yeah.
And so there were people at A&M especially that thought they were too soft anyway. Just let them go. It's not going to happen. And Herb has been quoted as saying, that not quite. I think there's something there. And he knew that they just needed the right song. And of course, that ended up being Close to You, followed very quickly by We've Only Just Begun. And that, made them a household name.
Yep, I love it. And from what I heard, he basically gave them carte blanche. He said, just do what you want. He didn't really have too much, like, you have to do this, you have to do that. He goes, just do what you do best. And I love that about him.
Well, and he assigned them a producer, but Richard is really the one who controlled most of that. I think the producer was in place because, they were in there. Well, Karen was 19 when they were signed to the record label, and Richard was in his early 20s. So I think to just turn them completely loose seemed like maybe they shouldn't do that. So they gave him a producer, and I think the first debut album was like a $50,000 kind of thing. So, but yeah, he was able to bring in orchestras and things like he had always heard in his mind, and now he could actually make that happen. And Herb was not in their business in that way. He trusted them enough to go in and just make their art.
So how long was it before they started going on tour? Was that the time when they went on tour with Burt Bacharach?
They opened some shows for Burt, not necessarily like a tour, okay, but they did open some shows for him around that time. They did some touring in 1970 and even went to Japan and did some shows there. So they were already internationally known after Close to You and We've Only Just Begun. But it was really in 71 that a lot of the touring really started to take shape. And that was when, their second album, well, no, that would have been their third album. Their second album was the Close to You album, with Close to You and We've Only Just Begun. But it was really when that self-titled album, the Tan album, as a lot of people call it, with Rainy Days and Mondays and Superstar and For All We Know, when those hits started to come out and really made them into headliners. Frank Bonito, who was one of the childhood friends there in New Haven, the first time he got to see them, they were playing at Carnegie Hall. So that's a pretty big deal to get to go see your childhood friends. And, he had heard about them and of course followed them and had their records and things. But the first time he saw them after having seen them as teenagers was on stage at Carnegie Hall.
Right. Well, speaking of headlining, I want to talk about when Neil Sedaka opened up for them. What happened?
That was in around 75. They had the same management, and Sherwin Bash was the manager that was with the Carpenters at that time. And Sedaka was making sort of a comeback at that point. And he ended up getting very comfortable with being back on stage again. And even though the Carpenters were the headliners and he was the opening act, he was getting a lot of response from the audience. His music was very oftentimes more up tempo and generating more audience excitement. than the Carpenters were happy with.
Yeah.
You want your opening act to be good, but not so good that when you come out, it's less applause or less cheers. And that's kind of what was happening at times, because he was coming out and working the crowd in a way that the Carpenters didn't really do. Carpenters weren't showy. They tried to be later on. They tried to revamp their stage show in the late 70s and be a little more theatrical, but it was really more of like a recital of their music. They would come out, they'd sing the song, and then they'd announce the next one and sing the next song.
Yeah.
But Neil came out and worked the place like it was his show, and he really overstepped. Like, Richard was already uncomfortable with the response that he was getting maybe a bigger response from the crowd than they were. But what really set Richard off was whenever Neil started to introduce some of the celebrities in the audience, like, oh, look who we have with us tonight. Here's, so-and-so in the audience. And that's, I guess, like a big understood no-no, that if somebody's going to introduce, then it's going to be the headliners. And so Richard threw a big fit backstage. He ended up firing not only Sedaka from the tour, but firing their management that they had been with for about 5 years by that point, 4 or 5 years. And it was something that caused, I know, Karen a great deal of pain. She was very close with Neil. And I think she felt horrible about the way that it all went down. And that was somebody I tried to interview as well. I spent a lot of time back and forth with Neil Sedaka's people. And it would be a yes, he can do it, and then no, he doesn't want to after all. And it just kind of went back and forth till it fizzled. But I wanted to get his opinion on that after all these years.
I would love to hear his version of that story, because from what I read or saw in the documentary, it was 2 of his friends. One was Dick Clark, the other one was Tom Jones. He knew them, he was friends with them, he didn't even think anything of it. And Richard got pissed off. And also, from what I heard, didn't Neil Sedaka's manager Neil Sedaka got fired, and also Richard fired his manager as well. So everybody got fired around the same time.
They had the same manager.
Oh, same manager. That's what it was. Yeah,
same manager.
Wow.
And so Richard said, no more Neil, and you go right along with him, because they parted ways with their management at that time.
So who did they get as a manager? I think they had, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Terry Ellis.
That was a guy named Terry Ellis. Yeah. He was the head of Chrysalis Records, and he just happened to be close by during this time because he was dating Karen. Mm-hmm. They had met through Karen's friend Frenda, and she'd kind of set them up. And so he was managing like Jethro Tull at the time, and he had all of these like rock groups and things that he was used to working with. But he had sort of become an advisor for Karen at times, showing her how to work the stage. Somebody like Neil already knew, you go over here and you sing to this side, and then you walk over here and you sing to this side, and you wave at, some unknown person in the balcony or whatever. And Karen didn't naturally do that, even though she was Hollywood, according to, the childhood friends and stuff.
Yeah.
That part wasn't necessarily natural to her after she came out from behind the drums.
Yeah. So yeah. She taught her that. It almost seemed like she was surprised. Like, why would the back want me to wave to them? She couldn't understand, like, you have to put on a show. And is that true? Well, I want to go back, because I thought it was like kind of ironic. The hit that they had at the time when they fired Neil Sedaka was Solitaire.
Solitaire. Well, they had just, I don't remember if they had just released it or were about to release it or what the order is there. But Solitaire was, of course, his composition. I remember whenever he was a guest judge on American Idol many years ago, Clay Aiken sang Solitaire under his guidance, and he said to the audience that night that was the definitive performance of Solitaire, like, of all time. And I thought, but was it really?
So Terry Ellis, he said he was only going to be temporary because he was dating Karen at the time. Who did they? Well, actually, because Richard at that time was getting a little mad that Karen was getting all the attention. I'm sick of being considered just the Karen's pianist. So what was Terry's What did Terry say to Richard to say, you know what, this is what we're going to do first to get people to let them know how talented you are and that you're really the leader of the band?
Yeah, they started at that point, and it was Terry's suggestion that they do this, that they announce Richard at the beginning and bring him out and sort of establish him as this, arranger and conductor and the one who's in charge of the whole group. So that's when they started announcing, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard Carpenter. And he would come out, the band or the orchestra there would play sort of a instrumental medley of some Carpenters tunes, and then Karen would come out and be introduced, which I think still makes Karen the most important whenever, they delay her entrance there. But the other part of that was that of course, this was long before any video screens or anything like that. So they ended up wiring a huge mirror that was slanted over the top of the piano to try and show Richard's hands on the keys. And that was another way that they wanted to show that, he's important too.
Yeah. Now, how long did he last as their manager?
Just like 6 months or so. It wasn't very long at all. They ended up going with Jerry Weintraub, who had been a manager for, he'd worked with Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra and all these big people in the 1960s. And he really was the one then who wanted to take and make them more into showmen and get them TV deals. And he had this whole kind of plan for what they would be next. Whereas the previous management had been like, let's get as much money out of them as we can while they're still popular.
Yeah.
I think Jerry did have a little bit more of a insight into these people are good enough and well loved enough, even if they're not selling records to the extent that they were, they're going to be around for a long time. And he thought that television was the next step for them to take them into people's homes.
Yeah. Well, he also, before he even got the television specials, he hired a choreographer and he also had a script writer. Is that correct?
Right. And yeah, so they were mostly known for their Broadway work. Ken and Mitzi Welch had done some stuff, and Joe Layton. And so they really came in and kind of blocked it all, blocked the here at this point, you're going to walk here and you're going to, and the outfits and everything, the designers, it was taken to a different level of showmanship. Yeah. And it wasn't something necessarily the Carpenters needed. I think they needed something to give them a little more interest on stage, but they didn't need a motorcycle running onto the stage during a Grease medley. And Karen in, with big fake boobs and things like that, singing "Look at Me, I'm Sandra Dee." It went a little over the top, and I think catered to that same. It was like that they had decided, okay, we are that cheesy group that they used to say we were, and so we're just going to embrace it. So there was a lot more shtick, as Richard calls it, that they were expected to do, and jazz hands.
Well, and then they had so Jerry is the one that put the TV specials together. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, as you mentioned in the book, it didn't really work out as well, because back then in the 70s, you had everybody, the Captain Tennille, the Donnie and Marie show, all these different variety shows. But what was the reason that you think that their shows didn't really connect with the audience?
Well, I think they got pretty good ratings, but their shows were just individual specials. They did 5 specials for ABC over a span of several years. 2 of those Christmas specials, and then other more general ones. Oh, there was, of course, the Space Encounters special, which we got into with the documentary, since Suzanne Summers was a part of that. But they never did, at least in the late 70s, they never did a series. And that's where most people knew, like Donnie and Marie and Sonny and Cher, because they had, a weekly series. Yeah. Carpenters just had, a yearly special kind of thing. And they had done a series, a brief series in the early 70s called Make Your Own Kind of Music. Mm-hmm. And they felt that they'd been horribly mistreated during that time, and just it wasn't a good experience for them. So they were not quick to, jump into another series kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it looked like, I guess Richard was much more uncomfortable than Karen was. Karen loved it. She actually wanted to get more into acting. She loved the maybe not the shtick as much, but she loved just having fun and singing songs. And and we're gonna get into Agnes in a little while, but what got me mad was one of the comments I heard was because Richard really wasn't on some, maybe not all the shows, some of the shows as much as Karen was. Karen was having fun, and the first thing Agnes would say was, "Oh, wasn't Richard great?" She wouldn't even mention Karen, wouldn't even talk about how everything, and she was 90% of the show. It's just that for some reason, like as you said, she had it in her mind that Richard was a star, Karen was just Karen. She was just,
Yeah, or Agnes would get upset if they weren't showing, cutting to Richard enough. And but anyway, as far as the TV shows go, that was something that I think did keep them in the public's mind, but it didn't necessarily help to elevate their career or popularity.
I watched maybe not all of the specials, but I was going through different ones getting ready for this interview. There was one clip I loved. It was Karen and Ella Fitzgerald singing "This Masquerade." I love that clip. And there's also another clip which from the documentary I saw in this one. It was a YouTube clip. It was just the network didn't like it because there was no shtick to it. It was all music. It was Richard going from piano to piano to piano, doing all these different things, and they're like, "This isn't a PBS special. we want more variety." And then that might have been the last one. Was that the show that you were talking about, or was that just another special?
That was a special. That was their last one for ABC in 1980, called Music, Music, Music.
Yeah.
And it was, Ella was a guest on that one, and that duet with them is fantastic. I really wish that Richard isn't happy with the specials enough to release them in their entirety. He has put together a collection of some of their best Christmas performances from the specials, but there's so much good stuff in some of the, I get it. There's some cheesy stuff, but that's part of that period of time. That's when you see the Brady Bunch series or Sonny and Cher singing with somebody you wouldn't expect. I mean, that's just what it was in the 70s. So I think most people can consider, the timing and everything, and don't think any less of the Carpenters for having participated in that kind of entertainment or humor.
I know, I'm surprised that all these years later he's still that uncomfortable. I would embrace it. Like, you know what, this is what we did, and maybe it didn't work out, but we had a great time, and who cared? Like you just said, like, you're like, wow, look at that. I never even realized they did that. If that was me, I would just release it all, and not even for the money, just because I think the public would love to see it, and I'd be proud of everything I did. And I mean, they obviously made their mark. He's not like he has to prove anything anymore. So I'm surprised that he's still that uptight about all of that years and years later.
That's part of the difference between him and Karen. She was very self-deprecating, where she could laugh at herself and would be able to, like, I can see her if she were still around and they were releasing the specials, saying, look at this, look how ridiculous my hairdo was here, or whatever it might be, and offering commentary in that sort of way. But Richard is so uptight that it's really hard for him to be that introspective of himself and be comfortable enough to laugh at himself.
I know. It's like, I don't, but I want to get into Agnes and Harold right now, because I found this very, very sad. So they're in their 20s, they're at the height of their popularity, they're making millions of dollars, and they still had an allowance.
Yeah, from the beginning of the checks coming in, Agnes controlled the money, and they were on an allowance, so to speak. I guess there was a lot of stuff going around about the Beach Boys having been taken advantage of by management and cheated out of a lot of money here and there. So she thought, well, we're not going to let that happen to these kids. I'm going to take care of the books. I'm going to, she would even go and put $100,000 or whatever in this bank, whatever FDIC would insure it for. You go in, you see the sign on the door.
Yeah, 250 or 750,000, I think it is.
So she would go and she would put as much as she could in that bank, and then she'd go to another one down the street and open another one. And she was controlling it, and in such an unsophisticated way that finally, I mean, she had to they had to pry the the checkbooks from her hands once they, the management finally came in and said, this is a big operation. This is a lot of money, and it's time to turn it over to the
Yeah.
professionals.
I'm just surprised. It seems like they were more intimidated by her, or not, maybe not intimidated, but they were more worried about getting her mad than, because I think if I was 20 something years old, I'd be like, you know what, mom, I'm a grown up. I can handle this. I'm sorry. I'm moving on. But they were just even so afraid to leave the house of getting her mad at that age.
They walked on eggshells around her, and
Yeah.
it was, I think, important to them to keep her happy.
Yeah.
Um, I've read a lot over the last year or so, about narcissistic personality disorder, and I mean, you can't obviously, um, say that someone was or whatever, but she definitely had narcissistic tendencies,
Yeah.
in the way that she controlled the children. And Richard, I mean, it's classic textbook narcissistic stuff when you look into this. Richard being the golden boy that can do no wrong, Karen being the scapegoat that kind of gets blamed for if anything goes wrong. Why weren't you there to do this or that? And I think that they were a little bit afraid of either disappointing her or setting her off. So everybody just kind of tiptoed around her, um, to keep Agnes from
Yeah.
blowing up.
Yeah. Well, there's one example I want to talk about this where Richard and Karen bought a house, moved the parents in, and Richard said, "Well, this is my bedroom." What was Agnes's response?
I can't.
Oh,
You
I'll
may
tell
have
you.
to remind me because I haven't read my own book in a while.
Oh, well, that luckily I wrote it down. She said, "No, this is my bedroom. You said you were buying me a house. This is my house."
Right. Yeah, and then shortly thereafter, Richard and Karen ended up buying another house,
Yeah.
and the plan was to move the parents there.
Yep.
And they were going to keep the big house that they had added on, like a big music room and a whole addition to the house. They were going to stay there and move the parents to this smaller house across town. Well, Agnes didn't want to leave. And
Wow.
so Richard and Karen ended up being the ones to move into the smaller house across town. And yeah, there were a lot of times I think that anytime that they tried to exert some sort of independence, Agnes would flip out. When Karen finally decided to move out on her own at like 24 and get her own condo, 24, 25 years old, Agnes called her a traitor.
Yeah.
And there was door slamming and yelling and stuff going on. And um, I think that Agnes liked their dependence upon her. It was important for them to not get too far out of her range,
Yeah.
um, because she liked to know when they were coming home and who they were with, and it was so intense, the control. They never really got to become independent adults.
Yeah. What's even more sad about that story where she called her a traitor was that Karen couldn't even tell her herself. She had her friend Evelyn say, "Can you tell my mom that I want
After
to
I'm
move?"
out of the house, yeah,
And
after I'm out the door.
from what you said in your book, she picked up the phone in the middle of the conversation. Evelyn said, "What the hell's going on?" She started screaming at her, "You're a traitor. I can't believe you're leaving me." It's like you're 24 years old. What was Harold's reaction to all this? Was he just a passive person that sat in the background and said, "You know what? Do what your mom says. I don't want to get
I
involved."
think he was all along that way, but especially in the late 1960s, shortly after they had moved to California, Harold had suffered a stroke,
Oh, okay.
which really, I think, kept him from being as involved as he would have been, which wasn't a lot necessarily before. Agnes ruled the roost, but especially after he became somewhat incapacitated from the results of that, he became even more, she would shush him a lot because either he would talk too slow or he would say something that she thought was inappropriate or silly. And so Agnes would just, berate him at times and just don't say anything at all. So I think he was somebody who, he would only chime in every once in a while with something funny. I know the guys in the band would say he would make little jokes here and there when she wasn't around.
Yeah.
But some of them called her the Dragon Lady. So it was,
Yeah.
everybody knew kind of who to stay away from or who to like I said, tiptoe around because they didn't want to set her off. Or, Agnes flipped out when anybody tried to exert control
Hmm.
other than her.
Yeah.
And Karen, even Richard at times, anybody else who tried to show independence,
Hmm.
because it was so important to her to keep them, in the home in the way that she thought that they should be.
Yeah, which I want to get into some examples of that. But before I do, there's something you mentioned either in the documentary or the book, and I felt so bad where Karen, like every time she'd call the house, Harold would say, "Oh, let me get your mother." And one time she goes, "No, Dad, can I just please
Right.
talk to you? I just don't want to. Please don't even tell Mom I'm on the phone." And she
Yeah.
just wanted so badly to speak to her father, but her father's like, "No, no, I'll get your mother for you." It's
Yeah,
like,
I think that was the expectation, is that when Karen called, you give me the phone.
yeah,
Agnes expected, hand me the phone.
yeah,
And she said, "No, Dad, I just want to talk to you." And
yeah,
that was something that um, Evelyn Wallace, the secretary, witnessed a lot of those kinds of things that I don't think it hit her until years later that was, important or could be part of the story.
yeah.
But
Well, one of the things where you talked about exerting power was their dating life, and
mhm.
Agnes was way too involved in that. And I want to talk about some of the examples of that. Was we'll start with Terry Ellis because we mentioned him earlier. She actually moved in with him, and
Yeah.
she was probably happy. But what happened to that relationship and why?
Well, Terry was traveling a lot. I mean, he was a busy record executive and manager, and he was constantly traveling. So Karen had moved in, and he was not one to just sit around and watch TV and do things like that. And Karen, I think, was so incredibly bored, for one thing, that she was just sitting at this house. um but it was, Agnes didn't think it was appropriate that she had moved in with him in the first place, because whether it was religious or whether it was just being conservative about certain things, she didn't think that a young lady should live with somebody that she wasn't married to. And of course, I mean, it was 1975 that this was going on, and so she definitely encouraged Karen to come back home. And I think, Karen thought she had gotten in over her head and that sort of thing,
Yeah.
moving in with Terry so quickly, and then she realized that they weren't going to get to spend a whole lot of time together. And um, but no, Terry had a really good understanding of the family dynamics when I interviewed him, and he was one of those people that kind of gave her the opportunity to get away.
Hmm.
And I think the family was so scared that either he would take her and go solo or encourage her to, do something without Richard, that he was seen as a much bigger threat than he actually was.
Yeah.
He was a very wealthy man. He could have shown her the world and, given her a wonderful life, and they were in the same business, and he was handsome. There's really nothing wrong with him, but it all happened so quickly. And I think Karen just got scared and once again retracted and went back home to what she thought was safe, the only thing she knew.
Well, what was sad about that too is she left while he was away. She hurried up
Yeah.
while he was gone. And from what you were saying in your book, I think it was, is that the real reason Agnes was worried about that relationship was because she was worried that he was going to make her a solo star and leave Richard in the dust. So it had really
Yeah.
nothing to do. I mean, maybe it had something to do, like you said, maybe religious reasons and living together. But the main reason was, again, it's all about Richard.
Yeah. I mean, this is some guy that could come in and actually give her a recording contract,
Oh,
and who could, do something completely different or encourage her to do her own thing. And I don't know that Karen necessarily would have. I think that she liked what they had going on with
yeah.
Carpenters, but the fact that she wasn't really allowed to, or it was so discouraged for her to, um, I think they knew that on some level, that even though Richard had always been planned to be the superstar, they knew that it was Karen that had taken them to that level. Even if Agnes wouldn't admit it, if she still said, that Richard's the star in her eyes. Um, I think that they knew deep down that Karen was the one paying the bills, shall we say?
I just don't, I mean, to me, I don't understand it. Like, if I was in a band, if I had a sister, I was in a band, I would be so proud of her. And not that I'd be riding her coattails, but we'd work together as a team. And like, all right, I'm part of one of the biggest groups around. I just don't think for me, there'd be no competition. I would, and if, or as a parent too, I'd be so proud of both my kids. I just don't know, what was going through her head. I mean, we talked about narcissism and things like that, but it's so sad. Could she ever say, I'm proud of you and I love you?
I haven't seen or heard of an instance of that. You know, I've heard some friends of hers say that she would say, "Oh, you look beautiful," or compliment her on something like that. Um, she would jump to Karen's defense if someone else said something or insinuated. I think there was something about Karen's drumming or something whenever they brought in Hal Blaine
Yeah.
do drumming on a lot of the hits. She was upset saying, Karen is as good as any of them. So if somebody else were trying to, if she thought somebody else was maybe threatening what they had going there, she would jump in and come to Karen's defense in that way. But she wasn't free with praise and I love yous. And that just wasn't the way that they did things. And I think Karen needed something so different than what the family offered.
Yeah.
And it was just a mismatch in that way.
Yeah. I think the story with Hal was that for the studio musicians, that she wasn't used to the studio, so they brought in a studio musician. And she's like, no. And this is where the studio said, you know what? We know what we need. Karen's not going to be playing drums in the studio. And that's when, so you're right. I did read that Agnes had her back on that one, but
yeah, even Karen understood why. She liked, she knew what the Wrecking Crew, talking about them again, she knew what they were capable of doing, and they had a hit sound and they could come in and do it. There was definitely more power and that sort of thing, I think, to his drumming than hers. She was a very accurate drummer, but she didn't have a lot of necessarily loud strength that maybe somebody like Hal did.
Yeah. Well, she was even tough with Richard when it came to dating. I mean, let's talk about the hairdresser and what happened with her.
Yeah, I think that, again, it was any time that the kids were threatened or their dependence upon her was threatened, because what if Richard, isn't, if I'm not the woman that he loves the most in this world? There was always that threat that an outsider coming in and messing things up for them, or coming in and wanting to just take his money or whatever it might be. And Maria, the hairdresser who was in the documentary, of course, she and Richard had a really nice relationship, and it was really just starting at about the time that Agnes interfered and sent Karen to go and fire her. Karen didn't really have a problem with her until Agnes came in and said, "We have a problem here."
Wow.
So she let Karen do her dirty business of firing her, and it caught Maria completely off guard because she didn't know there was anything wrong. Like, she hadn't done anything different with her job. She felt that she didn't know for many years, I think, until finding out more about what was going on behind the scenes with the family, that it was really Agnes that was the kind of the puppet master there, because she kind of thought, why is Karen doing this to me? Why is she, what did I do to Karen to make her mad? And it wasn't ever really Karen that was mad. She was doing Agnes's work.
Did she? And from what I remember in the documentary, she did make amends with her before she died. Is that correct?
They saw each other again shortly before Karen's wedding, and she was invited to the wedding. And so yeah, they didn't necessarily stay in touch, but I guess there were no hard feelings after that long.
Yeah. Here's one thing I was surprised about, and maybe it wasn't that serious, but she dated Alan Osmond, one of the Osmond brothers. And in this case, it wasn't Agnes, it was Alan's mother that said, no, you two can't go out. What was the reason for that?
It's so interesting. Again, the woman Frenda, who contributed so heavily to my book, she was the wife of one of the Carpenters managers, and her husband also managed the Osmonds. And so that's how that came to be in the first place. there was that kind of crossover or that commonality of the same management. And there are even some old, really hard to watch, but black and white home movies that were shot in the Carpenter's home at some birthday celebrations and stuff. And I think they're still on YouTube somewhere.
I gotta check it out.
What's that?
Nice. I have to check that. I didn't see that. I gotta check that out.
Alan Osmond is sitting on the couch, holding hands with Karen, which is kind of funny to see. But Brenda told me, she said, if you think the Carpenter family had their issues, actually, she said, if you think the Carpenter family was effed up, then you have no idea until you've seen the Osmond family, because she said, not only did you have the controlling parents and the issues with that, but you had the Mormon church behind it as well. And so she said, like, anything you're thinking about how messed up Carpenter's family dynamics were, she's like, she knew the Osmonds well and knew that that was also a kind of a twisted thing going on there. But no, that never really became much of anything. I think it was just kind of fun, flirty, spending time getting to know each other, but it never really took off, that relationship.
It's just so sad. You hear stories about the Osmonds, the Carpenters, the Jacksons, all these groups, and the parents, when they get involved, maybe they help make them superstars, but the cost to make them a superstar was just, there's no coming back from that.
Right. So I think it's Carpenters did pretty well for what they were dealing. I mean, compared to, like, you're talking about the Jackson family and stuff. I mean, there was so much abuse, and I guess some of what was going on with Agnes could be considered abuse, but it was more, there was some, I think, emotional abuse going on there, and subtle manipulation and stuff going on by Agnes. I don't think anybody looked at her and thought, oh, she's this terrible mother that's doing this on purpose, but she had her way of manipulation with the children. And see, I'm calling them children. They weren't really children.
I know. Well, sometimes when we're talking about it, I'm almost thinking the same thing too. It almost sounds like they're teenagers or even younger, the way that they were being treated by the parents. But you said it's a controlling issue. It was almost like controlling them made Agnes feel important or felt worthy.
Yeah. I think that's what she thought it was her job to do. And she used it in a way like she would say that she was doing it to protect them, but really it was all about control, I think.
Well, it got so bad, and I don't know if this is the reason why. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Richard ended up dating his first cousin. I mean, like, that way, there's no outsiders involved. This is really in the family. He kept it in the family.
And there are a lot of things online where people will say, oh, she was adopted and this sort of thing. It's just things that certain fans have come online to post about. She was actually blood related first cousin. She was Agnes's sister's daughter. And it was, I think, at first frowned upon even by Agnes, and at some point, from what the secretary told me, that even Agnes got on board with it, because she started to realize, oh, we don't have to let an outsider in this case. Maria, the hairdresser, mentioned in the documentary about, even when they did date, I think it was either her or Cubby O'Brien, or the two of them both were talking about, even when they did date, it was someone within the circle that they traveled with, like Richard with the hairdresser or whatever. And that's what ended up happening with Mary, who's Richard's wife. I think that it was just seen finally by the parents that, okay, we don't have to open up our family to some outsider that's going to come in and, take all their money or do this or that to hurt them. At least it's somebody keeping it all in the family, so to speak.
And from what I heard or read or saw in the documentary, Karen was repulsed by that, and she was trying everything she could to set Richard up with somebody else, and the biggest one she wanted to set him up with was Olivia Newton-John.
Yeah, I don't think Olivia was too keen on that, but
no, Olivia was very nice about it in interviews I saw. But you could tell, like, that's nice of Karen to think that I would be perfect for him. But I mean, the way she said it, you could tell, it's like, I had no interest in that.
Yeah, Karen was pretty furious because they were dating as early as 1976, Richard and Mary. And I think Mary was 16 or something like that, and Richard was at least 10 years older than that. And So I mean, he was dating a teenager, and she was going on tour with them all over the world. And people would ask, "Where did you meet?" And even years later, "Where did you meet your wife?" And they would say, backstage in Vegas, or that she was a secretary, or they would even give her a different last name.
Oh,
And I don't know, it really bothered Karen, and she was kind of embarrassed about it. And then I think they stopped dating there shortly for a while. But I know even at the time that Karen passed away, you can see in some of the videos and things where Richard was leaving the funeral home and that sort of thing with Mary in the car with them. So they were together at the time of Karen's death.
well, there's also, I think there's a weird relationship between Richard and Karen from what I'm seeing and reading, where Karen, well, I guess he brought his girlfriend to move in with them, and Karen's like, I'm moving back home. I don't want anything to do with this. And there's also a time where Karen had a date with Steve Martin, and Richard didn't like that. He's like, no, we got to rehearse that night. Sorry, you can't go. It's
Yeah, I
almost
think
like that they didn't like outsiders with each other either.
both of them. Yeah, it was like they each kind of would sabotage at times, even in subtle ways, if the other was getting too close to someone. And I think that was probably because they learned that by example from their mother. Like, this
Yeah.
is the way that you deal with maybe somebody that you see as a threat.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a lot of their perfection issues came in too, because whether it be, like OCD kind of cleaning stuff, or that sort of thing, like both Karen and Richard were extremely particular about things to the point that it was obsessive. I remember Olivia telling me that she went into Karen's apartment, and in the closet, the hangers were, I mean, not only was everything color coordinated and everything matched and was, the rainbow spectrum or whatever of colors, but that the hangers were all a quarter or a half inch exactly from each other.
Wow.
And so there was definitely some obsession, kind of obsessive compulsive,
Yeah, OCD. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
stuff going on there with Karen.
I feel so bad though, because what was Karen's favorite song?
It depends on when you ask her, but "I Need to Be in Love" is the one that she
Yeah.
referenced most of the time. And that was one that she said was kind of most personal to her, because, I mean, she was 26 at the time. It's not like her life was over, but I think
Yeah.
that she thought, "Oh my gosh, I haven't, found my husband or whatever yet. I haven't found my true love." And this describes kind of where Richard and her both were at the time. And also John Bettis, the writer,
Mhm.
the lyricist for that.
Yeah. Well, I felt so bad too, because between reading your book and seeing your documentary, she really never even had a chance for a social life, not only because of any outsiders, but the fans were fanatical, where somebody jumped on stage and said they were engaged to her. She and her friend got tackled on the street. Luckily, the band members were not too far from her. I mean, they wouldn't even let her use the bathroom alone. That's how bad it was. So she really never had a chance to become independent for many reasons.
I mean, it wasn't like today where you have the paparazzi chasing and stuff, but it was, I think, unlike anything people had seen before.
Yeah.
Because it was just that level of fame and that level of stardom hadn't been around necessarily for all that long. I mean, we can look back at like Elvis and stuff like that, but before that, there really wasn't much fandom in
Mhm.
America in that way, where you would, people would scream when they saw somebody that they loved or whatever. And yeah, even, I keep going back to this, but only because we were in New Haven together there with the childhood friends. They would tell me when Karen would come to visit them, that when they'd be in a restaurant or whatever, they would position her with her back to the rest of the restaurant, so that she didn't get bothered the whole time that they were there, that people wouldn't necessarily recognize her. Um, Although I've heard, many times people said that Karen didn't mind being recognized, that she liked that they were so loved and everything. But I'm sure after a certain point, it gets old.
Yeah. Well, one of her friends at the same place in Cafe 9 in New Haven was saying she was so oblivious. They went shopping in a store, and there was a whole line of people following her, and they're like, "Do you see this? Well, what are you talking about? She's paying with a credit card that nobody had any. She had no idea all the chaos that was going on behind her. She was just going, her normal day."
Yeah. Yeah. Frank told me that at times that people wouldn't necessarily recognize her, But then they would see her name on the, like she'd hand her credit card or whatever, and they'd go, oh, and
Yeah.
then hey, they'd be calling each other at some store or whatever within to the next register. Hey, Karen Carpenter just left my register. There she goes.
I want to talk about, we'll go back to the music because it was in the late 70s. The record sales were declining. And again, we went back, we talked about it a little bit, but they blamed it on their goody two shoes or goody four shoes image. So they tried to change that. And again, they did some more interviews. And this time they were saying things like, oh, yeah, we're definitely for premarital sex. And they even advocated marijuana use, which now is nothing, but back then was huge, especially for their demographic and the people that love them. And, again, the fans were really tough on them. What happened? What were the fans doing when they started doing interviews about that?
I know for sure that the marijuana thing, the mention of that was that they were for the legalization of marijuana, not necessarily they were encouraging the use of it.
Okay.
But that they just thought people should be able to do what they want, which was kind of their same opinion back in the early 70s when they were talking politics and religion and everything, like live and let live kind of philosophy. But yeah, it seemed like when you're telling people, hey, I promise I'm cool because look, I want legalization of marijuana, or hey, we've had premarital sex or whatever it might be, it almost backfires,
Yeah.
when you have to tell somebody that you're cool.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think it just played into that. Oh, I mean, you're looking at the cover of People magazine, it's them side by side, identical smiles, and it was just kind of too good to be true to a lot of people.
Yeah.
People would roll their eyes, but they loved the music too. I remember, I think it was one of the Carpenters managers that said, they would sell millions of albums, but nobody would admit to owning one.
That's it's funny you say that because I hate when people say, "Oh, my guilty pleasure is," for me, I don't have any guilty pleasures. I just have pleasures. I have no
Right.
problem admitting that I love Wham, I love Barry Manilow, but also I like Slayer, King Diamond. I like all types. I
Yeah.
like Mozart, all types of music. And it's funny with the Carpenters. I went on a cruise to Bermuda this last summer, and I heard, "Oh, it's Carpenters night." I went nuts. I loved them so much that I got up, started dancing. Everybody started clapping, cheering for me. And by the end of the night, the band's like, "Can you come to every show that we do because you're great again?" People thought that I was hired by the band to do that. They're like,
Yeah, you
"Are
were a
you a
plant.
professional cruiser?" I said, "No, I just love the Carpenters." And they actually renamed the band. It's called Seaside Duo with Sir Richard.
Oh my gosh.
It was funny, but I mean, I loved. Like I said, for some reason, I mean, not for some reason, they're great. That's the reason. It's just I've always loved the Carpenters from an early age. My mother used to play them. It was funny because my father introduced me to the rock and roll side. My mother introduced me to more of the pop side, and so I grew up listening to all of it with nothing about like, oh my God, you can only like this, you can only like
No
that. I just
qualms
grew up
about it, yeah.
liking everything, yeah. So, but yeah, it is funny you say it. Bee Gees, I think had a similar problem too. One of the Barry Gibb, I think was like second to Lennon and McCartney with writing #1 hit singles, but nobody will ever admit they liked them. And
Yeah, it's like anytime anything becomes too mainstream or
yeah,
oversaturated. I mean, I think we see that every year this time of year when people are like freaking out about Mariah Carey and here
yeah,
comes, All I Want for Christmas Is You.
yeah.
And it's the same people who are like, oh no, I don't ever want to hear it again. Then you'll like catch them singing along with it, the next time. So I think we all have those things where we're like, oh, if I hear that one more time, and then you're like,
You
having the best time with it.
Well, it's funny you say. I went into a store one time and I caught this woman singing "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go." So I started laughing. She goes, "Oh, you never know. You hear the song and you really don't like it, but you just can't get out of your head." No, I actually like that song. Oh yeah, so do I. As soon as I let her know that it was okay to like it, she goes, "Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
good song." So it's very similar. But speaking of the Christmas album, what year was that released?
78, the Christmas
78.
Portrait album. Yeah.
Yeah, and they had a special with that as well, too, right? A TV
They
special.
actually did a special in 77. I think, they were already working on the Christmas album music the year
Mhm.
before. And so they did some of the songs on the 77 special, then 78 is when it actually came out. But yeah,
Yeah.
they did two Christmas specials.
It was funny growing up. My mother used to always play the Carpenters, Gene Autry, John Denver and the Muppets, and Johnny Mathis. Those were all the Christmas
All
albums
good
that they
ones.
played. So I was just in Cape Cod where my parents lived, and I said, I was getting, telling her about this interview. I said, what was the favorite album of growing up? She goes, oh, by far the Carpenters. And I can't disagree with her. I love that album. I love their versions of the Christmas songs. And it's just, did that sort of bring them back to, I mean, I know, like, I mean, not that they ever lost popularity, but their sales were declining. Did the Christmas album come out and say, oh, that put them back on the charts?
It definitely did well for them, but I don't know that. I think it established them as, you know, Christmas artists in a
Yeah.
way, because that album every year does well, and you can't go anywhere this time of year and not hear them
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly. You know, whether it's a restaurant or a store or whatever it might be, you're hearing Carpenters at Christmas, and you don't really hear them the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Most of their other material doesn't get played unless it's, you know, a specialty station or something like that, because even on oldies stations, I mean, now oldies is what, 80s, 90s, and
90s,
2000.
yeah.
But you really don't hear their stuff on the radio except at Christmas time, and then it's like, you know, every half hour or something they've got another song playing.
Yeah. Well, there was a time where they wanted to try a country album, and the label said, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." I'm surprised. Was that wasn't A&M, was it?
It was A&M that,
Wow, I'm
yeah,
surprised.
I know that. I think it was Jerry Moss that kind of had a problem with it, but their albums had kind of gone more in that direction, you know, because country music in the late 70s and early 80s was more like country pop. It wasn't necessarily you know, Hank Williams and Loretta Lynn and Johnny Cash so much as it was Barbara Mandrell
Mm-hmm.
and Dolly Parton and some of these crossover artists that were getting hits on both, you know, pop charts and country charts. And you know, I would like to see where they would have gone with it. It's been discussed in Carpenter's fan circles that one thing the country music fans are very they keep artists around for a long time, where rock and pop a lot of times, you know, use them up and chew them up and spit them out. When they're done with them, they're done with them.
Yeah.
But a lot of times the country world keeps valuing their hit makers for longer. They might have had a little bit more longevity there. But they had done a few songs that might be considered country here and there. I mean, of course, Top of the World earlier in their career
I
was
love that
definitely
song.
country. But on the Passage album, which was kind of a mishmash of all kinds of styles and stuff, there were a couple of songs on there that might be considered country, and would have been interesting to see where they would have gone with it. I think it could have worked. But they could have done a jazz album too. I mean, it's not necessarily, it wouldn't have been very commercial, but I mean, she had such a perfect voice for jazz, and Richard's arranging. I mean, the fact that they started as a jazz instrumental trio, I would love to hear what they would have done with some really, you know, funky kind of Manhattan Transfer kind of stuff.
You know, I'm kind of surprised. That's why I wasn't sure if it was A&M, because in the beginning you're like, you know what? You have Carpenter. I know you said they hired a producer for them, but still, it's like they had so much success. Like, you know what? Let's just try it and see what happens. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is it didn't work, and we'll go back to the old formula. But even Karen said, she goes, the audience wants new stuff, but then they long for the old songs. She couldn't understand why they wouldn't let them do that.
Well, I think everybody, once they did start making the hit records, everybody was trying, you keep trying to get another one and top the
Yeah.
one before. And so, where in the beginning, yeah, they wanted to get a hit or whatever, but they were really just creating the music that they love to make. And then I think it started to come into play. Well, what's this radio station going to play? What are they asking for from, you know, what are the fans wanting, or what's going to work on top 40 radio? And they became almost obsessed with, you know, the chart position of each song and that kind of thing.
Was that around the time when Occupants came out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there was a lot around that time too, with how many times were they playing Carpenters every hour on certain radio stations. And
Yeah.
I didn't know much until I interviewed some people that worked at A&M, but talking about payola, and where, you know, different record companies would kind of pay underground to get this particular song played more often, and then they would have somebody who was listening to that station all day long and charting to see if they were playing it as many times as they were supposed to.
Yeah, it's similar to Alan Freed in the '50s, the whole payola scandal with the, and then he was taking money from the musicians or even the record companies, and then he got, I mean, he ended up getting taken off the radio, and he ended up dying bankrupt. It just, I mean, there was a lot of other things to it, but yeah, the payola has been going on for a long time. But I didn't realize that was even going on back in the '70s. I thought it
Yeah.
stopped by then. So that was because Occupants, that's for them. I thought it was kind of a weird song. I know we mentioned before it's like the three Bs: Beach Boys, Beatles, and Bacharach. Is that sort of like, you know, their version of Pet Sounds, where they're trying something different?
um Possibly. Richard was starting to deal with his Quaalude addiction at the time,
Hmm.
and all of the things that were kind of his go-to hit recipes, I guess you might say, what he would normally do, it just wasn't working for them in the way that it did in the early 70s. And so I think they were kind of just grasping at straws, like, oh, do we want to do this? Like they did a Broadway show tune from Evita, and
Yeah.
they did, a country piece called Two Sides, and Sweet Sweet Smile, another country song. And then Occupants was just this weird avant-garde kind of prog rock sort of thing that um, you can't really describe it to people. You just have to let them experience it. And it was epic in because I think the people who had originally recorded it, Klaatu, had used a lot of synthesizers and stuff. And Richard came in and orchestrated all of that with a full, huge, symphonic orchestra.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think they were just kind of taking a stab to see what would work. Are there any of these that are the right direction for us to go next?
Yeah. And it
And
wasn't
it
a hit in
ended
the
up,
US, but in Japan it was a big hit.
yeah, it was there. There are some songs on there that I think would have been the right way for them to go, but as an album, it doesn't
Yeah.
play well. It's not. A lot of their albums before that had been thematic. Some of the ones in the early days would even start with an opening song and then end with the same song, and like to bookend it.
Yeah.
And they were very much themed. And in the case of Passage, it was just all over the place.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned Richard's Quaalude problem. Let's talk about how he got into that. So he went to Agnes and said, "I can't get to sleep."
Yeah, that was really early on, like end of 71 or something. They were traveling so much. And she said, well, this is what the doctor has prescribed for me for sleeping pills. And so here, try this. And the story goes that he took them as directed for a period of time, and it did what it needed to do. But he also realized that there was the high effect that could happen,
Hmm.
and began, I think, in the early to mid 70s, abusing them in different ways. Maria, who we interviewed for the documentary, said that when they were together, they would each of them take one each night the way they were supposed to, and that was it. That they weren't using them recreationally at that time.
Yeah.
And so at some point, mid to late 70s is when Richard kind of went off the rails with that.
Yeah. Well, you were saying he took up to 10 pills a day. That's a lot of Quaaludes.
Yeah, and he got to the point, I mean, we showed in the documentary, there's this picture that almost illustrates it perfectly, although I think he was just, having a moment. But they said he fell asleep at the piano during
Yeah.
Toby O'Brien said that Richard fell asleep at the piano during a rehearsal. And they were, as it got even worse, Richard was so shaky that he was unable to play some of the more intricate piano parts that he was used to playing. And so they were cutting songs from their playlist and their set list and stuff.
Yeah.
Near the end of 78, beginning of 79. Actually, it would have been the end of 78. Their last concert performance, really, as Carpenters, was December of 78, a Christmas thing. And they cut a lot of stuff just because it relied on Richard's piano proficiency, and he wasn't proficient in that kind of a state.
Well, there's times it's in your documentary clip where Karen was on a talk show or some kind of show, and they're like, "Oh, where's Richard?" And she came up with a joke about why he couldn't make it, and she's here, so she covered for him a lot. And was there ever a time where she used a different pianist?
It was really just that one time, the one that you're
Okay.
talking about, and
Yeah.
where they had gone to England, and it was right after this time I was talking about where he was too shaky to play.
Yeah.
And so yeah, a different pianist went with them, and they continued with that particular promotional trip. Um, the only other pianist that she ever worked with would have been when she did her solo album there shortly thereafter. And we of course interviewed Bob James, who was one of those.
Yeah.
Greg Gaines is another who did some work with her in LA for the solo album. And so yeah, she worked with other people, but I think she was so used to she and Richard had such like a one track, not want to say one track mind. They thought a lot alike, and almost like ESP. They knew what the other
Yeah.
was thinking, and so she worked. And I think it was more difficult for her to have to explain how to do something or what she wanted or the sound, because usually they both knew what they wanted.
Yeah.
And
That was a perfect segue. Sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say that was a perfect segue because I wanted to talk about the solo album next.
Mm-hmm.
When she said, "Oh, I'm going to do a solo album," what was Richard's reaction?
Well, I think it was probably "I believe you will not" at first, because he was in rehab at that point in the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, finally addressing the Quaalude issue. And you know, the way that scene in the TV movie about them plays is that he said, you know, I come and check myself into this place, and now you're ready to jump ship. And I think she saw it as, you know, I can still keep working. She didn't think there was anything wrong with her, and obviously she needed to probably be taking her eating disorder more serious at that time, but wasn't ready for that. And yeah, Richard was not thrilled at all, and I know that the family was. And I say the family, it just means Agnes. Is what's interesting, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think Harold probably had an opinion on it. He wasn't allowed to. But again, I think Agnes saw this as a threat to Richard. You know, Richard takes this time off. Now Karen goes solo, and what's going to happen to him? And you know, the solo album was something that I'm glad that Karen got to experience it. It's that one of those times that I think she tried to throw the doors open and say, "This is me. I'm Karen Carpenter, not Karen of the Carpenters."
Yeah.
She was never really considered for Female Vocalist of the Year and that kind of recognition. And she was always, you know, part of a duo. So they would win as duo or a group or whatever. But accolades for her as a singer were going to other solo artists, whether it be Helen Reddy or Olivia or these other women of the mid to late 70s. I think she wanted to know that she could do something on her own, apart from Carpenters. And sure, I mean, her sound is the Carpenters sound, but I liked that the solo album gave her an opportunity to choose the song she wanted. And it was right up there with what other people were doing at the same time, whether it be, you know, some people call it her disco album or whatever, because there were a few songs that were disco tinged, but she was doing the same thing that, you know, Barbara Streisand was doing at the time, and Olivia, and it's a much stronger album than I think what the Carpenters did before or after it. Not completely before. I mean, obviously I'm not going back to Rainy Days and Mondays or something. But it was stronger than Passage for sure. And definitely stronger than Made in America, which came after it in 81. There's a quote from a writer for the New York Times that I've always thought was interesting. And it's something along the lines of, you know, there wasn't a "We've Only Just Begun" on that album, but there didn't have to be. That wasn't the intention. It's not that she was trying to do something that would one up something so classic as that. She just wanted to spread her wings and explore musically and see what she could do on her own.
I personally loved it too. I listened to it. I think it was released in '96 finally, and I enjoyed it. But what you were saying, either in the book or in the documentary, was she finally got Richard's approval, and he says, as long as there is no disco.
Yeah,
And I
don't
love
do
what
disco.
Karen said. Yeah, but what she said was, you know what? The first thing was, my favorite song is Hot Stuff by Donna Summer. Let's do something like that. And I love it.
Yeah, it's like when the cat's away kind of thing. So she definitely answered to Phil Ramone, the producer, when he asked, "What do you like to do?" Yeah, that's when she said, "I love Donna Summer."
Well, the funny thing too is, there was 2 songs that she was offered by Rod Temperton. What were they?
Oh, now you're putting me on the spot.
No, I got it. Off the
Rock
Wall and
with
Rock
You
with
was,
You.
what was the other one? I'm sorry, Rock with You and
Off the Wall.
Off the Wall. Okay. So yeah, they were, and it was just stuff that Rod was working on at the time. He was living with Phil Ramone and Phil's wife, and Karen was too at the time. So it was kind of this creative musical compound that they lived in, and they would go into the city and record, and then go back out to the house, and they would throw ideas around here and there. And those are some of the things that he was working on at the time, not necessarily for any one person, but they ended up then getting, they were just kind of riffs and ideas and sort of almost like a map of the songs at that time. And then they became fully developed, of course, for Michael Jackson's album.
Yeah. And Rod Temperton, for people who don't know, was in the band Heatwave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But
I knew his name mostly because of Thriller, then years later with Michael Jackson.
Yeah. What I found surprising too is that she put $400,000 of her own money into this album. I mean, she really, wanted to do this, and I just felt so bad. We're going to talk about the reaction from the family after the album was released. And Olivia makes a comment of what Richard said. Do you remember what that was?
Or was it Frenda that said it? I don't. I know Olivia said, "You've stolen the Carpenters sound."
Yeah,
that's one thing. And then, unfortunately, though, he also, from what Frenda told me, is that he told Karen that the album was shit.
Yeah,
and he was not kind to her. And I don't, it was Frenda was saying, "My God, just fake it. Just say, great job, say something," because she had poured heart and soul and time and money into this and presented it like, "Look what I did." And it was just shot down in such a way that it was deemed, really, from Richard and the other record executives that listened to it with Richard present, it was deemed unreleasable. Like, you're going to have to go back and record something else. Like, it's not releasable as is, which I think is, well, it's not funny, but it's so interesting because A&M, the label, released a disco album from Ethel Merman the same year. So apparently Ethel Merman's disco album was deemed releasable by A&M, but Karen's
that's
it's just sad that she wasn't supported and encouraged, even if they didn't want it to go the other way, where the Carpenters would not be the Carpenters anymore and Karen would stay solo or whatever. I think just to have been kind to her.
Didn't Richard realize all she really wanted was his approval? He never realized that?
Wow. I don't know if he knew that was, that's expressed a lot, especially by Olivia in the documentary, that meant more to her than anything.
Yeah.
Richard's opinion. And then for him to be so harsh about it. I think Richard thinks that Karen made the decision herself to shelve it. Yeah. But with that kind of reaction from the people that she trusted the most, I mean, if she trusted him more than anybody else, and he told her it was, there's no way she could have made another decision if she really trusted him the way that she did.
Well, I like her reaction. Who was it with? I think Phil Ramone. What did she say not too long before she died about the album?
Let's see. I think it was the last time they talked on the phone. She said, we made a fucking great album.
Yes. I'm so glad that she believed in it.
But she realized it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
As Phil explained to me, and I think he's said it in several other documentaries, when they would talk about it after that, there was obviously sadness around the fact that it hadn't been released, but that he wanted her to celebrate that she had done it. Mm-hmm. Like, just because it's not out in the marketplace doesn't mean that, we didn't make something really great here.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard to convince somebody of, because especially somebody who's into watching the charts and airplay and all of that stuff that's going on. I think that's what Karen missed. And I wish she'd had the opportunity. If it failed, it failed, but let her at least have the opportunity to see if it did.
Yeah. The one thing I was happy about was during the recording, she was treated like a rock star because she had Billy Joel's studio band, Peter Cetera from Chicago, Paul Simon, and they all were glowing about her, telling her how great she was. I'm glad that she had a chance to feel that from other people instead of just like, yeah, Karen, you're just a singer. Just, go back to what you normally do. Richard's a star. So I think at that time she was like, yes, this is great. I'm glad she got a chance to at least feel that for a little while.
Yeah, there was a lot of great camaraderie with the guys in the band and stuff too. And I think she felt like part of the group, in a lot of ways, like the way she was in high school with the guys in the drum line. And they would tease her and tell off-color jokes and things in her presence. And I think she liked that, like just kind of being one of the guys. They would forget that, oh, we have a lady in our presence or whatever. They just made her one of them.
Yeah, she's just like basically like one of the guys. It seemed like she had such a great sense of humor. And I love that. Well, after the recording, she took a break, and then she wanted to get married. And going back to Terry Ellis, she found out that he was engaged. And what happened then?
Trying to remember with that exactly. I know that she went to him basically saying like, do you want to give it a try again or something? And then she found out that he was getting married. And it's like after the response to the solo album, them saying, it's not releasable, or at least giving her that impression, I think she felt like she had failed that, and she was looking for yet another way to show some independence.
Yeah.
That didn't work. And then, so what else can she do? It wasn't, the musical independence wasn't happening. So she was ready to get married. Yeah. And she meets, of course, she kind of had reached out to Terry, and I think maybe was looking for, maybe I should date somebody at this point in time. And she was set up on a blind date with a guy named Tom Burris around the same time that the solo album Rejection happened. And it's hard to not see, when you see the calendar of how things happened there, how the solo album was shelved, and then almost immediately she meets this guy, and then within 2 months they're engaged.
Yeah.
And just a few months down the road after that, they're getting married. I think she was just looking for some way to feel like she was in control or making decisions for herself, even if they weren't necessarily the best decisions.
Yeah.
And this turned out to not be a good one, because of course he, as we talked about in the documentary and more in depth in the book, he was not who he presented himself to be.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. The first thing he said, "Oh, I never heard of the Carpenters." It's almost like Yoko Ono saying, "I never heard of the Beatles."
Yeah. I love that Karen's response was, "What, have you been under a rock for 10 years?"
Yeah, it's like right then, that's like a dead giveaway. Something's not right with this guy. And it's sad because, like as you mentioned, they were engaged within 2 months. She just wanted something. The family loved him at first. The friends are like, he seems a little too perfect, something a little too phony about him. So they were more onto him than the family.
Yeah. Well, it turned out he was still married too.
Yeah.
And so he ended up going to Mexico to get a divorce or something. And it was just this, he disappeared for a while, and then came back in and wanted to marry her. So he got things situated to make that happen. And yeah, he gave himself the appearance of being independently wealthy, but he had, the yachts and the planes and all of that, but it was either borrowed or rented or whatever it might be. And so he gave this appearance that he was a big shot. And some of her friends really just kind of saw through it and thought, he's kind of too good to be true. I remember Phil Ramone said that he told her, "I don't like his hair," which he really didn't mean I don't like his hair. He kind of just meant, I don't trust this guy.
Yeah. Well, who was the one that hired the private investigator to check him out?
Either Richard or the family.
Okay.
And I think that was, I don't know exactly what they found out. I know it wasn't anything horrible enough to call things off, because Karen even got to a point where she was ready to call off the wedding. And Agnes said, "Oh no, you don't. You're going through with this."
Yeah. You
And
made your
so,
bed, now you lie in it, or something to
yeah.
that effect. Wow.
Well, yeah. So keeping up appearances for the family was also really important to Agnes. Don't mess with the plan once it's already, you know, in motion. We're going through with it. We'll deal with it later.
Yeah.
It was her feeling.
Yeah. Well, the reason she wanted to call off the wedding was because she wanted children so badly, and then she found out he had a vasectomy. So he
Right.
lied to her not only about the money, not everything about this, but he also lied to her that he couldn't even have kids anymore.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's when I think it had been several little things. And then that was finally the thing that made her say,
Yep.
"Listen, this is not the guy I thought he was."
Yeah.
And she called and told her mother that the wedding was off, that he had lied to her, and what else could he have lied to her about, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And instead of Agnes supporting her and saying, "Well, whatever you need us to do," or, like most parents would say, we're here for you, kind of thing.
Oh,
Hers was that the invitations had already gone out, that People Magazine was going to be there and doing a photo spread, and we'll deal with this later. And that's when she told her, you've made your bed, now you have to lie in it. And it's just such a cruel response, but unfortunately very
very
um
Agnes.
yeah,
Very much that
on
that's like
brand.
yeah, wow. So then she goes through the wedding. She has that fake smile. I've seen videos of the wedding, and well, I love the story that her friend said that he was so enamored by Olivia Newton-John, so he's taking pictures of her, and that's when security came over and said, "Excuse me, you can't be taking pictures. I was told by Karen Carpenter I need to take pictures." "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, sir."
Yeah, he told him, "I'm a friend of the bride," and she
Yeah, I love
asked me
it.
to.
I love that story. But anyway, so she went through with it, and then she said, "All right, reverse the vasectomy like you promised, and maybe we can make it work." What was his reaction to that?
I don't know too much about that. It wasn't something that was common back then. Like
Yeah,
now, a reversal of that sort of thing is, I
yeah,
think, commonplace, and it wasn't so much back then. I think he had told her or said, "It's not a big deal. I'll get it reversed or whatever." Um, but he was so cruel to her in the rest of their relationship that, I mean, I hope at some point she stopped wanting to have kids with this person.
yeah,
And yeah, it was way worse than I could include in the documentary or even in the book.
yeah.
Um, there were things that Frenda had to have me turn the tape recorder off whenever I was interviewing her, and other things that just for legal reasons we had to tiptoe around. And he was not a good person. And
Mhm.
I used to want his side of the story. There's that
Yeah.
part of me that's a researcher and biographer that you want to hear from everybody. And I lost so much respect for him, the way that he mistreated somebody who was so fragile at that point in her life, that I don't know if I would even believe anything he has to say at this point.
Well, according to your book, when she said that, he says, "No, you're a bag of bones. I'll never have sex with you." That is, like you said, so
Yeah.
cruel, so mean to her. And she at the time is giving him loans of $25,000, $35,000, $50,000. And then finally she said, "You know what? I'm not a bank," but she still was
Yep.
doing it. Oh, it's so sad. I mean, he must have went in there with an agenda. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew who she was, and he went for the money. I mean, it's not so
Yeah.
obvious that was his intention. Because
Yeah.
didn't
It was
you said, sorry to interrupt you, I just want to say, because you said he was married. Didn't he go back, get divorced really quickly and say, "All right, I'm free, I'm single now. Let's get married"?
to Karen. Did he do that?
No, he went and he was like, you said he was married, so he went, got divorced immediately, and
Yeah.
then said, "I'm single," and then they got engaged.
Yeah, I don't know that Karen even knew necessarily that he was married. She just knew he disappeared for a while. And it turned out later on, the friends and family realized or
Oh,
found out that that's where he had been during that time,
oh,
that he had gone to take care of all of that. I remember Frenda seemed to think that there was some kind of almost, she had kind of a conspiracy theory with it, that she thought that his ex-wife was even in on it, that they
oh,
thought that, oh, he's met this rich superstar, and if we get this divorce or whatever, then he can get this money from her. I don't know. She really thought there was more to it. And most people I've mentioned that to said, "Oh no, it wasn't that. It
okay.
wasn't that deep or anything." But um, yeah, it was just the worst thing that could have happened to her following the rejection of the solo album. Not only did she have to go back to recording with Richard after that opportunity to do something on her own, but now she had this guy that was treating her so horribly, and she already had such low self-esteem. I can't even imagine what, say the things that he said to her and the ways that he made her feel. I mean, I'm sure it was difficult to live with somebody who was in the throes of anorexia at some point in time, but it was definitely not the way to encourage her or to support her in any way.
So after everything that was going on, what was the final straw where she said, you know what, we're done? What finally got her to say, I'm leaving?
I know that there were several things with cars being repossessed.
Yeah.
And banks coming to collect on certain things. And I know that was a big part of it, but she had been she showed up at Frenda's door like kind of in a heap, and she showed up at lunches and things wearing dark sunglasses. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot pointing to more than just the
emotional
and verbal abuse.
Yeah.
And so I think at a certain point in time, her friends encouraged her. Like, she went back to him several times after the family thought that she was done with him. Mm-hmm. But then finally there in the end, I think she realized that, I know one of the last times that the family saw him, they were at a restaurant together, and there's a picture of them together, and he looks like such a jerk. He's making some silly face, and she's sitting next to him weighing no more than probably 90 pounds. And after that dinner at that restaurant, they went back to the house and went upstairs to talk or something. And I think they were, the family was aware they were having some issues, but then things got loud and heated. And then he stormed down the stairs and told the family, "You can keep her." And, but from what Frenda told me, she still, wanted so badly to be loved that she would go back to him even after things like that.
Wow.
And but at a certain point, I think she realized it was over, at least temporarily, while she took some sort of control over the anorexia issue. It was around that time that she started to finally admit to her friends, "Okay, I realize I do have this thing I've been telling you forever that I don't have. I do, and I'm going to go and get fixed."
Yep.
And that
was at the end of 81.
Yeah, end of 81.
So, as you mentioned in documentary, you mentioned in the book, anorexia was never really spoken about. People really didn't know exactly what it is, especially to the extent that it is now, that people, everybody knows what it is and the effect it has on people. So back then, nobody really talked about it. So she was really suffering silently, and maybe she didn't even know really what was going on, but she did finally admit she had a problem at that time. And let's talk about some of the things that she was doing, because from what I heard, she had a laxative addiction. She was taking up to 100 a day. Wow.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that.
I know that what her friend, Karen Ramon, Karen called her Itchy because her maiden name was Ichiuji.
Yeah.
And she was traveling with her in 1981 for some of the promotional tours and things for the Carpenters Made in America album. And she said as soon as they would get to a new city, Karen would have the car stop and let her go into a pharmacy. And she said sometimes she thought it was because she had built up such a tolerance to them that she was taking an entire package of them or whatever, or that she wanted to get rid of the evidence. Mm-hmm. Like, so she would just take it all and then move on. But yeah, so that she was taking different types of diuretics. She was getting prescriptions for Synthroid, which would speed her metabolism, although she had no thyroid issue. And it was, she had introduced at some point into this whole mix the Ipecac syrup, which induced vomiting, for emergencies only, though. And people didn't know that it continued to do damage when it was, used more often than it was supposed to be. I think a lot of people had that in their homes. Parents had that for young children in case they, swallowed something poison or, ate something they weren't supposed to or whatever.
Yeah.
Karen was abusing that as a way to, rid her body of food. And so all of these things coming together, I think were like this perfect storm of, this deadly cocktail almost of, because people don't necessarily die of anorexia.
Mm-hmm.
They die from other things that happen because of that. And in this case, I think that there was such a strain on her heart, what she was doing with this, that definitely contributed to this. She was just really playing, horrible games with her body and not thinking that it would really end the way that it did.
I just don't even know how she would be able to function. I mean, especially like on stage. How could she stay on stage without some kind of gastrointestinal um,
Yeah.
accident? I was like, I'm so not impressed by that, but I'm just saying I'm so surprised that she was able to like hold it together so well. I mean, you could tell she was just getting skinnier and skinnier, but I mean,
and Carpenters weren't doing full concerts at that time either. They were making promotional appearances for the album.
Yeah.
And so they weren't really touring
at
that point. They had stopped that really in the late 70s. And so by this point that this woman was witnessing this with her, it was at a time that they were just, doing little appearances here and there and that kind of thing.
Okay.
But she was really, it's interesting. One of their associates said that she was the most truthful and honest person that you would ever meet, except when it came to the anorexia.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the deceit and the lying and everything that surrounded that to keep it her personal private secret was so out of character for her because she was so honest and truthful in the rest of her life.
Yeah. Well, some of the things she did was wear several layers of clothing. Then she would say with her fork, push the food around and make it seem like she's eating it. And then she'd say, "Oh, you got to try this. This is delicious." And by the time everybody tried something, there was nothing left on the plate for her. So she thought, I mean, I think she probably did fool some people with that for a little while. Like, "Oh, she's eating. She's fine." And then people started to catch on like, "Yeah, you're really not doing this." So finally, as you mentioned, she said she needed some help and they got a doctor in New York. Let's talk about that doctor and the effect it had on her and what the family thought of it.
Yeah, he was actually not a doctor. He was a psychotherapist of some kind. And the reason she even found him was because he had written a book called The Best Little Girl in the World about a young girl who was struggling with an eating disorder. And Karen was so private in her in this disorder that she had going on that she was reading up about it and studying it almost behind the scenes, and that was something that she had read. It was turned into a TV movie, I think, in 1981. And so even though he wasn't necessarily known to be the best or the expert, he was kind of the celebrity expert, and who Karen knew is who she wanted to reach out to, the guy who wrote the book that became the movie.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the best, advice to go on the guy who, wrote this book and the TV movie and all that. So he ended up not being the right fit for her, obviously. And sorry, my dogs are driving me crazy. And she, even though she was saying that she wanted to get better and that she was dedicating this year, which really probably wasn't a good thing to say, I'm going to do a year and be done. But she was still doing things to counteract whatever progress she was trying to make. Because
all right, so we'll talk about the doctors. I want to get into this because at that time it was 5 times a week, $2,000 a month he was charging. He really wasn't a real doctor, as you said. So he picked her, and I want to talk about what was going on there because there was a time when he had the whole family in there, and he said, "Tell Karen you love her." And what was Agnes's reaction to that?
Yeah, it was almost exactly like what was portrayed in the TV movie there.
Yeah.
She was her friend Karen Ramon was there with her.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm still. Sorry, I was sick last week, and do you think would we be able to do a part 2?
Oh, definitely. Yes.
Is that
Well, that wraps up the latest episode of The Claw's Corner. A huge thanks goes out to author, creative consultant, and producer Randy Schmidt for taking time off his extremely busy schedule to be a guest on my show. I also need to thank editor extraordinaire John Bristol for the award-winning Elmwood Productions for always doing a superb job editing the show each and every week and making it available to all on YouTube. I am also extremely grateful to Rob Bull and Joseph Timothy Quirk for all they do to make my show available on several connected radio stations, as well as Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, Audible, and iHeartRadio. Thank you both very, very much. And lastly, but definitely not least, I need to thank you, the viewer, for always tuning in. Enjoy your day, everyone. Part 2 very soon.
Suckers! All of a sudden I hear, brim, brim.
What's a diaphragm again?
Ha! We caught one.
They're supposed to be weird.
Oh, yeah, no. If you say so.
I've always wanted to be in a movie.
Waiting around for autumn, waiting around for autumn. I was watching the TV, I was watching the